For Putin, it's an important lifeline. China is effectively underwriting his war in Ukraine through substantially increased trade. Last year, trade between the two countries was at a record $240 billion. And China is buying substantial amounts of oil, filling the gap that was left by the end of oil sales to Europe. For China, it emerges as by far the stronger in this partnership. It has the upper hand, it is the stronger partner, it's getting cheap resources, it's getting status. And it's also, I think, in the eyes of Xi, tying down the West in Europe and drawing attention away from China's behavior in the Pacific, particularly its aggression in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. So, in a sense, it suits Xi at the moment to have this continue, and all of the time staying just behind the absolute red line of supplying weapons to Russia. Although, of course, a lot of dual use items have gone there, which is very worrying for the West.
Now, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the leaders of Russia and China, have vowed to cooperate against what they call the destructive and hostile US. They've agreed to strengthen military ties and economic partnership after talks in Beijing. Well, President Putin concludes his visit to China today. Let's get some insight from Ian Williams, former foreign correspondent in Moscow and Beijing and author of Fire of the Dragon, China's New Cold War. Morning, Ian.
Good morning, Chloe.
What are the implications for this agreement between Russia and China? The language, perhaps unsurprising, saying that the US is destructive and hostile, but the military and economic ties being strengthened. Should that be a concern for people in the West?
It is a concern, and I think it represents quite a considerable rebuke to Washington, to Brussels, to London, where politicians have been trying to persuade Xi to use his influence with Moscow and also to lessen his quite considerable support, economic and to the Russian military machine. The language used today and yesterday, while being quite performative, quite slogan ridden, would be worrying, I think, because for the first time, Xi is very openly identifying himself with Russia, talking about the joint containment of the two countries. Also, when he rolled up in Beijing yesterday, Putin brought with him senior officials from the Russian defense industry. Now, that would suggest that they have a bit of a shopping list, and would also suggest that Antony Blinken's request to Beijing that they stop supplying dual use items such as chips and machine tools, which are helping sustain Russia's defense industries, have fallen on deaf ears. So, yes, I think this represents a strengthening of the alliance between the two countries. We will see more military drills and more dual use support for Russia's war machine in Ukraine.
What do they both get out of it? Because there are obviously differences of opinion on some things and some tensions and challenges, but what do they get out of this relationship?
Well, I think for Putin, it's an important lifeline. China is effectively underwriting his war in Ukraine through substantially increased trade. Last year, trade between the two countries was at a record $240 billion. And China is buying substantial amounts of oil, filling the gap that was left by the end of oil sales to Europe. For China, it emerges as by far the stronger in this partnership. It has the upper hand, it is the stronger partner, it's getting cheap resources, it's getting status. And it's also, I think, in the eyes of Xi, tying down the West in Europe and drawing attention away from China's behavior in the Pacific, particularly its aggression in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. So, in a sense, it suits Xi at the moment to have this continue, and all of the time staying just behind the absolute red line of supplying weapons to Russia. Although, of course, a lot of dual use items have gone there, which is very worrying for the West.
The dynamic of the relationship is quite interesting as well, isn't it? Because these are two men who are used to getting their own way.
They are, and two men who have effectively have jobs for life because both have changed the rules in their respective countries to enable them to stay on beyond what would have been time limits on their rule. two men that have a similar vision of the world, a similar sense of victimhood and resentment, a similar desire to restore national greatness. With Putin, it's his Ruski Mir, his idea of restoring the Russian-speaking world. With Xi, it's the China dream of restoring national greatness, starting with, of course, taking Taiwan. So they have a very similar view of the world. They're both hard men, they're both autocrats, they both accumulated considerable power and shown little tolerance of any dissent. So they've got a lot in common, and the personal chemistry, I think, between them is very close.
Really interesting to speak to you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Clay.
That is Ian Williams. He's a former foreign correspondent in Moscow and Beijing. He's author of Fire of the Dragon, China's New Cold War. And it is just, I mean, it's fascinating. And also, as Ian said, they're worrying when you have the two huge powers like Russia and China saying that we're going to come together militarily and economically. And when using words like to move against the destructive and hostile United States.
And what do you do as the United States, as the United Kingdom, as allies?
Counter it.
What do you do to get in the face of that? And there's so much strategy in not doing very much, actually, and sort of just letting them almost talk themselves over there.
It's right. Donald Trump is great mates with Putin.
That'll
so
solve
if he gets elected, it'll all be sorted.
That'll solve it.
Let's move over to the Far East now, because the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, well, they're in the midst of a 2-day meeting in Beijing. It's the third time the pair have met in the past year, and today we saw the two leaders praise their no-limits friendship and deep ties in an appearance before the media, while criticizing the United States military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. So what can we glean from this state visit so far? Let's talk to Samuel Green, Professor of Russian Politics at King's College London and Director of the Democratic Resilience Programme at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. How's the resilience going, Samuel? It's under a bit of pressure,
Well, judging by your previous conversation, not so hot.
Not so hot. Okay, so we've seen the picture of the two leaders and their no-limits friendship being bolstered with the exchange of red books and documents. But outside of the optics, what's the real substance of this visit, do you think?
Well, outside of the optics, look, the real substance of this visit is the fact that we don't actually get to see the real substance of this visit, right? This is a meeting between two leaders. Unlike we just saw Xi in Paris, last week, in which they have to face the press, and Macron has to answer, to the French public and to the broader European public, what the nature of the relationship with China is. Neither Putin nor Xi are going to face difficult questions from their parliaments or their press corps or the broader public about what they're doing. They do need each other. Whether or not they really like each other, we don't really know, and we'll probably never really know, right? But they do, both serve a useful purpose. I think the reality is that, China cannot achieve and Russia cannot achieve what they're trying to do both domestically and internationally without some degree of support from the other, but that masks a real asymmetry, right? The dependency of Russia on China is orders of magnitude greater than the other way around.
I'm just wondering how far Russia would go to give, how far China would go to give Russia cover, given that its a great trading partner is the United States, and it doesn't necessarily the US doesn't want to wag the finger at China, but it is slapping all kinds of sanctions and tariffs on companies that appear to be getting too close to Russia.
Yeah, well, that's that's really the question. Russia has come to the conclusion that for it to achieve what it wants to achieve in the world, it really has to change and challenge the way that the world functions, particularly as a trading system and as a financial system. China has its own gripes, obviously, with that system and with the sense that it doesn't have enough power and leverage within that system. But broadly speaking, it has prospered from that system. It has become a great power, probably the second most powerful country in the world, as a result of that system, and is not necessarily interested in doing what Putin would very much like Beijing to do, and really helping to blow that system up. The question then becomes, one for President Biden, one for other Western leaders, for European leaders, about how do they deal with the very real concerns that they do have with China? China can be a difficult and in some cases a very aggressive power to deal with. People are rightly nervous about what China's intentions are in Taiwan and other parts of the Indo-Pacific. But there is a danger that if Western governments approach China exactly the same way they're approaching Russia, that if they approach it through sanctions, through using the international trading and financial system to impose penalties on it, then they may not give Xi much of a choice other than to solidarize with Putin and to try to dismantle those same institutions that the West is trying to use to hem in Putin in his war in Ukraine.
I'm just looking at a quote from Putin saying that China's proposals could, quote, lay the groundwork for a political and diplomatic process that would take into account Russia's security concerns and contribute to achieving a long term and sustainable peace. Now, didn't the Chinese put forward a 12-point plan for peace and security in the Ukraine war? And of course, it was rejected by the Ukrainians. I'm assuming the Russians would have blessed it, given that they might have been party to China's thinking. Where are we with that, do you think?
I don't think we're really anywhere with it. There will be later this summer a peace conference in Switzerland. China is not expected to be at the table. Russia will certainly not be at the table. The problem with the Chinese plan, at least as it stands at the moment, is that it suggests that the way out of this war is for Ukraine to give up territory. Territory to which Russia has no legal claim or no moral claim. And not to really get anything in return for it, right? So even if you might occasionally find people in Ukraine or in the West who think that it's a good idea for Ukraine to acknowledge that there's some territory it might not get back, and I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing that idea. Ukraine has broader concerns about, well, how is it going to stay safe from Russian aggression in the future, and it sees no alternative other than to seek protection in a relationship with NATO, whether that's formal NATO membership or some kind of a looser arrangement. And that's exactly the kind of thing that the Chinese peace plan rules out, right? So it's a plan that would leave Ukraine both diminished and impoverished, but also vulnerable. And it's very hard to see why any Ukrainian government should be expected to sign on to that kind of plan.
And Samuel, just to close, I mean, you're director of the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I was joshing with you a few minutes ago saying, how's it looking at the moment? But in all seriousness, I mean, how robust would you say is democracy certainly in the European sphere and then beyond at this point? Because everyone's been saying it's the biggest year ever for the democratic mandate in countries, about 70 countries around the world. But, well, what do we say?
Look, it's not an easy picture. I mean, I think the good news is that, as you mentioned, there's a lot of elections going on, and everybody seems to accept that elections are the appropriate way of deciding, how countries are governed and by whom, and that everybody needs to respect the outcome of those elections. As you can hear an American, it's not always the case. In the country that I come from, unfortunately, that people see it that way. I would hope that we might learn some lessons from Europe. But look, we've just seen the attempted assassination of the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico. We have seen an uptick in political violence really across Europe. We've seen it in this country here in the UK, and so there are very real reasons to be concerned. There are growing constituencies who believe that our institutions and our ways of doing politics are not working for them. And if we don't address that, we will face increasing problems.
All right, Samuel Green, thank you very much. And Samuel is Professor of Russian Politics at King's College London and Director of the Democratic Resilience Programme at the Centre for European Policy.